For this video, we're going to be looking at fine-tuning the workflow that we might have in place as we think about adding audio files to a session and how we can use those files and incorporate the mix template that we've put together as a starting place. Sometimes, depending on the files that we have, starting with the mix template and importing the audio files into that template is going to work great. And that will be especially true if the mix template and the audio files that we have were created at the same sample rate and bit depth. If those two things are incompatible, the way you're going to want to do the importation of the audio files is to do a new session, set the session sample rate to match the audio files that you're bringing in most cases. And then we're going to add the mix template after by importing those tracks that are going to be useful for the current project. So to get into that, I have this tune called Borderline that I'm going to be working on. And I've got just a completely blank Pro Tools session here. And in this session, there are no tracks. And the only thing that I've done is set the session sample rate and bit depth to be the same as the audio files that I'm bringing in. So we're going to start with that from a workflow perspective, and then we're going to add the template and then do a little work with that to see some of the things that we might be able to do with that template. So depending on which of these methods you end up liking working with, there are three principal ways that you could bring in files to work with in Pro Tools. One of those ways is going to be able to use a Finder window, find the files that you want to bring in, and just drag them across. And when my mouse catches up, right, and you can just drop them there onto the edit window. That will always work, especially on a Mac machine. I've had trouble doing that sometimes in a Windows environment, but your mileage might vary on that. So that is one available path to that. The second is to use a workspace. And in Pro Tools, if you go to the Window menu, New Workspace, right? And for Pro Tools, the workspace is a very kind of full-featured environment to be able to get to everything that is on the hard drives that might be attached to your computer. But it's also a system for searching for files. It will play back and give you the option to audition files. You can actually audition files at the tempo of the session. The workspace has a lot of power, and it's beyond the scope of this particular video to think about that. But it's worth digging into. And from our perspective here, again, all I need to do is navigate to the folder where I have those audio files, make a selection, and then exactly as I would if I had a Finder window, I can drag and drop over here. And Pro Tools will create a brand new track for each one of those audio files, and we can start building out the session from there. Okay. The third way to do this is to use the File menu and use the Import Audio function. And I'll just show that to you quickly. So when you get the Import Audio dialog box, like we have here, once again, you would navigate to where the files are, make a selection, and then add them to the session. And you'll note one thing that's important from a Pro Tools language perspective, that at this point, the audio files change, right, from a naming convention from audio files to clips. And Pro Tools uses the words clips to describe anything that has an appearance here in the edit window. They look like files, but actually they are references to the audio files. And in the beginning, the clips are the exact same length as the audio files, but we can, of course, edit them and manipulate that to a great extent. So you might have one audio file that has many, many, many clips. So that's part of the reason why those two things end up being different in terms of language. From there, if I've added them and now they're in the clips to import, I can hit done and it will add them to our session. I already have all the files here, so I'm going to cancel for the moment. All right, and now you can see here I have the 12 tracks associated with this tune Borderline. And I could begin working here, but then our template is not in place. Right? So we're missing the organizational elements, the signal routing components, and the beginning look that we've started to do in terms of how to separate frequency ranges to make this a better, more efficient mixing process. So let's bring the template in. And from here, actually, we could use, again, there's a number of different ways to get to the template. Since we've already kind of talked about the import option under the file menu, let's use that this time. So file menu, import, and let's say this time session data. And what will this will allow us to do is bring in information from actually any Pro Tools session that we have attached on the various hard drives on our computer. Anything that has info that might be useful in terms of the session, and that would include track setup, parameters for particular tracks, processing and the setups of those plugins and processors, and even other audio files, right? We can bring out any of that kind of stuff into this session using the session import function. So here I have my mix template, and to click that, I can hit open, I can double click it, both will do the same thing. At that point, then I will have the import session data dialog box. Top part of it is primarily for working with other kinds of media. So getting our audio lined up with time code for working with video and other kinds of sources. So for the most part, when working with straight up audio functions for music, I don't use the top part of this very much. So we'll focus down here on the tracks area primarily. And you'll note that there are two columns of information here. First, the source column, and this is a linking to all the tracks that are in the mix template, right? Or the session that we're trying to bring stuff from. Destination are the tracks that we will make or that we can replace some or all of the data of that exist in this Borderline session. Currently, there's nothing connected or routed between those, so we get to make some choices. And I think in this case, what we would do is look at the tracks that are part of the Borderline session and bring in the appropriate routing folders for these instrument groups. So that would be bringing the first, the organizational output folder. And to do that, I can just click anywhere in that band of information and it's going to change the destination to new track. Right? There's also a drop-down menu where you can choose new track. Right? So we'll need the drums, we'll need bass, we need guitars, we need the vocals, and then the three tracks that make up our output section, really: the mix bus, the print track, and the master fader. None of these tracks have any audio data on them. They only have plugins and routings. So we don't have to worry about the playlist options here. But if you were bringing in audio files, you would want to check this box to replace the existing playlists. And more importantly, if you're bringing in processing that was on a track that had an audio file, but you don't want to replace the audio file in the session you're currently working in, make sure to hit the Do Not Import button. And otherwise, the defaults that are here are going to work fine for our purposes. We'll say OK. Pro Tools is going to do a little bit of thinking here. And first restore the tracks and also bring over all the plugins that I might have in place along with the settings that are already there. And in this case, my mix template's a little bit built out, so it's going to pull up a couple things and take a little bit longer, but there it is. Right? So there's all the tracks rather from my template, and they show up here in the tracks list. Right? The tracks list has a lot of functions, and one of the things that I like about it a lot is that it really makes it easy to move tracks and to kind of work with that organizational component, because I can see them all here. I would have to change the size of the tracks in the edit window itself to see them all. So I'm going to work in this direction by just clicking and dragging in the tracks list. So the first thing could be to put the output to the far left of the session or the top of the tracks list. And then we need to put the groups of tracks to match up with their routing folder or their submix. So drums, bass, here's acoustic and electric guitars to the guitar mix. And didn't mean to grab that one. Lead vox to the vocal mix, and then the backgrounds to the vocal mix. And then there's the mix bus, the print track, and the master. And what's nice about the tracks list, especially relative to these, the relatively new thing about organizing with folders, both basic and routing folders, is that you can see the hierarchy laid out here. So the output folder contains everything except the master fader. And then the drums mix contains all of the drums tracks, right, etc. When you're working with routing folders, it's very important that they are actually assigned to the correct layer. Otherwise, they won't play correctly. So in this case, we have them all set up, and we can flip to our mix window and check that that is also the case here. Right. And then we can kind of take a look around and double check things like our basic routing and make sure that that's all correct. And at this point, none of the new tracks with audio on them are assigned to the input of the routing folder. So we want to make sure to do that first. I'm going to select all of the drum tracks, and I'm going to use a shortcut key combination to switch all of them at the same time. And that key combo is the Shift key plus the Option key, Alt, on Windows machine. I'm going to click here where it says main out. I'm going to say track, and then I want them to go to the drums mix. And all three chains at once. Bass is just a single track, so we'll do that one that way. For the guitars, again, make a selection, Shift plus Option, choose track, guitar mix. There they go. And same for the vocals. One more time. And at that point, everything is completely routed. My mix template already had the routing for all of the routing folders to go to the submix, which is the mix bus for them. The mix bus is linked to the print track already, and print track will play through to the main output. And at this point, let's give that a play and make sure that we have audio working everywhere we expect it to be. good. So the audio is all working, and right now what we're listening to is 100% just the raw tracks as they were recorded and then given to us. So none of the musical functions of our mix template are at play yet. And we talked about being able to divide up the frequency ranges. So the first thing that we would want to do is activate the EQ3, which we put on all of the submix folders with their predetermined ranges as a starting place. Again, they can be adjusted if need be. But let's just pull in the EQ3 and just take a second to listen to that and see just what the effects of the mix template are. And the thing that I notice almost immediately, right, and let me make sure that I've actually got this playing correctly here. Just some headphone correction software here that we'll talk about in a later video. That once we put turn the EQs on, right, especially the relationship between the bass guitar and the acoustic guitars here in the beginning separates out, and the acoustic guitars become much more prominent. We can hear them much more greatly because we don't have as much masking between those sound sources. And I think throughout the Borderline project in particular, like how to get the acoustic guitars working well with all the other things is going to be part of the mix. So it should start here with the basic mix template. EQ is just one part of that possibility, especially now in a contemporary DAW environment where we have the ability to model not only EQs, but complete channel strip arrangements and consoles of all types. Right? And so one of the things that I've done with my template is to build it out with those EQs as a starting place, but then to take those same concepts and put them into full-fledged channel strips so that I might audition possibilities where, yes, it's the same high-pass and low-pass filter arrangement, but now I bring in the sound of a console, the things associated with the preamp and the coloration that might be there. So we have some other possibilities. So the first thing to try out is the Shep's Omni-Channel, which is one from Waves. I like this one a lot. And I have, just to start off with, the filters are set up in the exact same way as they are in the EQ3. It's actually not true here. There we go. Right. So we get the same effect of the filtering, but now we also have the preamp and the saturation stage associated with the Shep's Omni-Channel. Let's check out what that sounds like. And that's a really interesting sound there. It, because of the amount of saturation I have dialed in, does something different to the bass sound especially. But the separation between bass and acoustic guitar is even greater on this particular setup. And let's look at then the Focusrite channel strip. This one's from Brainworks. And once again, I have the settings the same for the high pass and low pass filters as the Shep's and the EQ3. So I have that separation component. And now what we're hearing is, again, the sound of the rest of this circuitry. Good separation between those sound sources again. But now there's something sweeter about the top end of the acoustic guitars, especially. That's nice. It works with this track pretty well. And I typically start with one other in place, and this is from Acoustica. This one would be a little bit more of a vintage approach than the Focusrite or the Schoeps Omni channel. And again, it's got a preamp section, and I have the settings dialed in for the wrong instrument. And now I have them set for that. All right, so let's hear what that sounds like on this particular tune. So that's got an interesting kind of push to the low end of the acoustic guitars. That's really nice. While still also kind of, what's the right word? It's still a little shiny on the top, shinier than the Schoeps was for this, but not as shiny as the Focusrite. So every one of these channel strips is going to give us a little bit of a different kind of taste of the sonics of it, which is going to apply itself to these tracks in a particular way. And as I audition these things through for lots and lots of different projects, the right answer completely depends on what that source material is like. I think in this case, I like the Amethyst quite a bit. So we could start there. And the other thing that I frequently have in a mix template is emulation for tape machines. Let's make sure we get them all happening. Right? And so I have 3 different tape machine layouts here for 3 different tape plugins. But you could also emulate this with particular saturation plugins. You could take one of these tape machine plugins and do different settings for it to set yourself up with a kind of a path to audition some other possibilities. So let's start by hearing our tracks through the Amethyst and now through Kramer tape. And now what you begin to hear happen once you start to layer in this idea of tape is you very frequently start to hear some kind of depth components. It's not just that the frequency ranges are separate, but I often hear with tape, I start to hear things kind of moving forward and back, or I hear the space a little bit more, kind of building an environment, or at least emphasizing the environment that's there. And this one, it's got a nice sound. It's controlling the low end quite a bit, and sort of has a vintage vibe to it because of the tape machine that it's modeling. Here's another one. This one's from Slate Digital. This is the virtual tape machine. Let's hear what that one sounds like. This one's pretty interesting sound as well. It definitely, with the virtual tape machine, you can hear a lot more kind of the air up on top. So I wanted to listen through until we had some good kind of cymbal sounds happening there. Definitely opens up the top end quite a bit more than the Kramer tape does. So that's an interesting sound. And then lastly, let's try out the J37 tape machine. This is from Waves and Abbey Road. Right? This is a modeling of the tape machine the Beatles are most famous for using. Also very interesting tones there. It emphasizes quite a bit more the mid-range component, right? It's not as much air as with the virtual tape machine, but I think maybe even there's slightly more of that depth component here. So which one's the right tape machine? Okay. Sometimes you get that, like all three sound good. It's just that also all three are different. So I think in this case that I like the Amethyst plus the virtual tape machine. And let's give that another listen to just kind of confirm what those sound choices are like. Yeah, I think that's a very satisfying sonic profile to lay over these tracks as a starting place. And then, of course, next up would be for us to really go in and do the gain staging of the tracks themselves, taking a real hard listen at what our sound sources are like. In the drum tracks, for sure, we have 3 microphones, or probably 4 with a stereo pair of overheads. Going in there and making sure and checking phase issues and relationships for sure. Right, getting a feel for how the tracks really work, and then once we've done that gain staging, we start to build a balance and do some of our initial panning moves and kind of start to lay things out, so we begin to kind of get a really good sense of what borderline could sound like, so we could start to put together our vision for what we want to do from a mixing perspective. Right? But the key things here are importing files and making sure that the session matches the sample rate and bit depth of the files you're bringing in. Importing as much of your mix template as is appropriate for the tracks that you have. Right? And then in this case, looking at a kind of a more fleshed out build out of the mix template to Audition not only the high pass, low pass filter arrangement that we have, but now also that running through console emulation, channel strips, so that we get the sound of those consoles, the sonic characteristics of those consoles, in addition to the fact that they leave us with a bunch of additional processors. Right? So as we start to get going here, if I want to reach for an EQ for the drums, there's one already in place with the channel strip of the Amethyst, and same for dynamics control with compression. And then we layered on top of that some tape emulation to add kind of some cohesiveness, some of the sonic characteristics of the tape machine, right? And having that now as a layer that can be auditioned inside of our template, right, gives us more and more possibilities for working with the template and matching up the sounds and sonic possibilities of our processors to the audio that we have brought in.